Hi and welcome to Midnight Cry. I'm your host Romel Gussain, and today we have with us Jay Smith, who'll be discussing with us the problem of the Quran. First of all, welcome to the show, Jay.
Hey, it's good to be here.
I mean, we've been able to go episode after episode and see problem after problem, these flaws and these cracks. I mean, we've been able to discuss somewhat the rise of Islam, the emergence of Islam. Was there a Mecca? Which way the Qibla actually did face? The problem of now the Quran. We've got all these problems early on in the history of Islam.
Yeah.
Can we please discuss on this segment the problem of the Quran?
Well, all of these lead up to that, because if the traditions are not even written down until the 9th and 10th century, if they're all redacting back onto a man named Muhammad, and when you look at Muhammad, you'll find that the references to Muhammad in the traditions do not jive, do not parallel what we know about the Muhammad of history, and that which we know about the emergence of Islam doesn't even include any people called Muslims, or a religion called Islam, or a book called the Quran, or that Muhammad is a universal prophet. We don't even have a reference to the Shahada, that there is only one God, but God, Muhammad is his prophet, until 691. Then the next question he asked, well, then what are we going to do with this book, the Quran? Because this is the book that basically glues it all together.
Yes.
This is the foundation of Islam. If you don't have this book in place, then you've got a problem. Now remember, according to Muslims, this book has always been. It was never created. Surah 85, Ayah 22 says that. And it says that this comes from the eternal tablets that exists in heaven. The
Uncreated.
Preserved tablets is what it says in English. Now, when all the exegetes, when they talk about the preserved, they mean the uncreated tablets. If that is the case, then all these facts and figures that we have been talking about
Should point to it.
well, not only that, they have always been. Therefore, they cannot be in error. Doesn't matter whether or not much of Islam was created in the 9th and 10th century. The Quran, of all things, should have everything right, should get it correct.
Yes.
And so if it says that the Qibla in Surah 2, Ayah 145, was redirected to Jerusalem, then was brought back down to Mecca, there must be a place called Mecca. And if there is no place called Mecca that early, and if we don't have any references to a place called Mecca until 741, as we saw in the last episode, then what are you going to do with Surah 2, Ayah 145? What are you going to do with Surah 3, Ayah 96, that talks about Mecca as being the earliest inhabitant, the earliest place of worship for all of mankind? What are you going to do with all the references to Muhammad in Mecca? What are you going to do to all the traditions that surmise that Muhammad was receiving this revelation? The second half of the Quran, all of this part, is supposed to have been revealed to him in the place called Mecca, if there is no Mecca. Which then suggests that maybe this book was not from Muhammad. Maybe this book was written much, much later and redacted back onto Muhammad. Remember, on one of the earlier episodes, we talked about the Dome of the Rock. We talked about the inscriptions on the inner ambulatory, that those inscriptions written in 691 or 692 do not parallel with this book. Now, Muslims tell us that this book was compiled over a period of 22 years, 23 years, from 610 to 632. If that is the case, then we should certainly find all kinds of references to it. We should find all kinds of people that knew about it. We should find people in the 7th century that talk about it. We can't find any references. But more than that, we should be able to find manuscripts of the book itself. Because the Muslims tell us, in fact, if you go to Al-Bukhari in volume 6, hadith number 509 and 510. So volume 6, hadith 509 and 510, mentioned that at the time of Uthman, the third caliph, around 650, so about 18 years after Muhammad's death, if Muhammad died in 632, 18 years later in 650, after the Battle of Yamamah, many people were killed, and many of those who had memorized the Quran, according to what Al-Bukhari says, died, which means they were dying with this memorization in their minds, gone. And so Abu Bakr was commissioned a man named Zayd ibn Thabit to write the Quran down. And he writes the Quran down, takes it from many different sources. And that codex is given to one of the wives of Muhammad named Hafsa, and she keeps it under her bed. That's happened in 632 and 634. 18 years later, Uthman comes and decides to rewrite it again. A second rendition, or a second revision of the earlier one. And he takes Zayd ibn Thabit again, along with Alas, Zubair, and Harith. The four of them were to rewrite the Quran. It says in volume 6, 509, verses 5, or reference, or saying 509, and saying 510. They come together and they rewrite the Quran. And Uthman turns to them and says, if you have any disagreement amongst you, write it in the Qurayshi dialect. How could there be disagreement if it's exactly the same? This is the uncreated Quran and it's never changed. How could there be any disagreement? You just copy it like a Xerox machine from Hafsa's copy onto this one, right?
That's right,
you would think. So how can you have any disagreement? And he says, if you have any disagreement, write it in the Qurayshi dialect. Qurayshi dialect. Dialectic differences take vowelization. You're an Arab speaker. You've written Arabic. Arabic is always a consonantal text. And the consonantal texts need vowelizations to know the difference between the dialects. That's when you read a newspaper, an Arabic newspaper that was written in Egypt. If you want to read it in Morocco or in any other part of the Arab world, you better keep the vowels off it, the dhamma, the kasra, and the fatha. Otherwise, you will not know what you're reading.
Yes.
The dialectic differences are delineated by the vowelization. There were no vowelization in the 7th century. Vowelizations were only invented in the late 8th century.
Wow.
You can't have had any dialectic differences that early. Al-Bukhari didn't know what he was talking about. Of course, Al-Bukhari was writing this in the 9th century when there was vowelization, when there were dialectic differences. At that time, it would make sense. So he's redacting back on the 7th century something that he should not have been doing. He didn't know what he was talking about because he wasn't living in the 7th century. But beyond that, it then says that Zayd ibn Thabit did this. He then rewrote the Quran in the Qurayshi dialect. Then Uthman, according to Al-Bukhari, Uthman then takes all the other manuscripts that disagreed and burned them.
Wow.
Burned manuscripts?
So there were many manuscripts at that time.
Obviously. That's why they had to rewrite it.
And there were differences in those.
Absolutely. That's why they had to rewrite it. Wow. But what was more, and this is what Muslims need to ask, why do you burn manuscripts? Do we burn manuscripts in Christianity?
No.
Is there any reference to biblical manuscripts being burned?
No, they're important.
No, we keep all our manuscripts.
Yes.
We have 24,000 manuscripts, 5,300 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin Vulgates, another 9,000 in 11 different languages. We know where all those manuscripts are. Some of them are as old, can be dated right back to the 2nd century. We have all the Chester Beatty manuscripts. They're the P45 and the P46 in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. We've got the Sinaiticus, the entire New Testament by the 4th century. They're in London. Right next to it is the Alexandrinus. If you go over to Rome, you get the Vaticanus. We have 3 of the Metropolitan Codices from the 4th century. That's 300 years before the Quran. We have a good 250 manuscripts of the New Testament, either partial or complete, by the 6th century, 100 years before the Quran even came into existence. We do not burn our manuscripts for one very good reason, because we preserve them so everybody can look at them, so you can compare them.
That's right.
The only instance I know of burning of manuscripts is in Al-Bukhari about the Quran.
Wow.
Which suggests that the Quran was destroyed in 650 and a new one took its place. This is 18 years after Muhammad died. So Muhammad never saw this Quran.
So this is from a Muslim Islamic source.
These are the earliest Muslim sources. Wow. Al-Bukhari, you don't get anything earlier than him when it comes to the hadith.
Do Muslims know this?
They should. It's their material. That's why Muslims, before you start claiming this great claim about how the Quran has never been changed, ask yourself, just read your own traditions about how this book was put together. But more than that, we know Dr. Arthur Jeffrey in the 1930s, just by looking at Islamic traditions, looking at the hadith, looking at the sirah, looking at the tafsir, looking at the tahriq, the 4 genres of Islamic tradition, he was just able, in 1930s, he was able to find 16 different references to 16 different Qurans. References to 16 different Qurans. Wow. None of them agree. He found 4 metropolitan codices, 4 majority codices that he noticed about. One was the Codex of Ubay ibn Ka'b that became very popular in Damascus. Another was the Codex of Ibn Masud that became very, very popular in Baghdad. Another was the Codex of Ibn Musa that became very popular in Basra. And then the Codex of Zayd ibn Thabit that became very popular in Medina. 4 different codices from 4 different cities, known as the metropolitan codices. These are the 4 major codices of the Quran. And he found between these and the 16 others, 15,000 differences between these codices.
That's huge.
So how can the Muslims say that the Quran has never changed? What material are they talking about? What manuscript are they pointing to? And where is that earliest manuscript? See, I'd love to ask Muslims, where is that earliest manuscript? Now, they always point to the Topkapi, which is in Istanbul, which is there in the Topkapi Museum. And they also point to the Samarkand manuscript.
And why isn't that valid?
Well, take a look at the script on it. When you look at the script, and we'll put them up on the screen right now, you'll see the script of the Topkapi, which is here. You can see it here. Take a look at the script that's on it. You can see it's a very specialized script. It is known as the Eastern Kufic script. It is known as the Abbasid script. This is a script that was introduced by the Abbasids in 749, the mid-8th century. They introduced the script. It's very easy to identify because it has elongated consonants. Consonants are elongated. You can see it very clear there. It's elongated text.
Yes.
It's very stylized. With the Topkapi, you will notice it has medallions. Every verse is interjected with a medallion. Medallions were not introduced into Qurans until the late 8th century. Versification was not introduced, until the late 8th century. The medallions are there to show where every verse is. So how can you have a versification in the mid-7th century? Now, Muslims say, well, this was added at a later date. But take a look. Every time you see a medallion, you will see a gap to accommodate it. Are you suggesting that they wrote this at the time of Uthman and kept the gap there with the intention of making this a verse in the late 8th century?
Impossible.
Yeah, you can see how stupid that sounds. So this is obviously a late 8th century. Some scholars would say that the Topkapi is now a 9th century manuscript. The Samarkand the same way. Take a look at the Samarkand. We'll show it on the screen right here. And you can look at the Samarkand. It is also that elongated script. And you will see 4 different pages. Take a look at those 4 pages that we're showing you there. And you will see that they're different styles of writing from 4 different authors. But that only goes up to around Surah 41 or Surah 43. It's not complete. There's 114 surahs. The second oldest Quran that we have in existence, I'm going to put it up right now. Take a look at this. The second oldest Quran is known as the Ma'il Quran. It's known as the 2165 manuscript. That's the number it's given to it. It's in the British Library in London. You can go see it. I see it all the time. Now take a look at the script that's on this Quran. It's a completely different script. This is a Hijazi script. It's slightly slanted to the right. It's called Ma'il because that means slanted. This is known as a second oldest Quran in existence. It is dated to the late 8th century, about 690. Late 790, late 8th century. It is not from the time of Uthman. It's not even from the same century as Uthman. It's about another century later. And yet it uses the Hijazi script that you would have expected to be on these earliest Qurans. Now what's interesting is a new manuscript has now been discovered that even predates all of these, known as the Sana manuscript. Have you heard about this?
No.
Okay, the Sana manuscript is a well-known manuscript today. It was discovered in 1975 when they were cleaning out the Sana mosques. They opened a trapdoor and all these manuscripts fell to the ground. Hundreds of them. One of them had a script that they could not read, and it was this Hijazi script. And we're going to show you a page of this. They couldn't read it because nobody was an expert in reading archaic scripts. So they flew down in 1981, Dr. Gerd Puyn and Dr. von Bothmer. Dr. von Bothmer and I think Dr. Oleg as well, 3 of them who not only teach at the Saarland University in Saarbrücken, Western Germany. They are known as the world's authority on the earliest Arabic script. And so they were flown down in 1981 to look at this manuscript. And they quickly took pictures and put it onto a microfilm. Now, that microfilm was confiscated by the Yemeni government in Sana'a when they realized what they were finding. They didn't like what they were hearing, so they confiscated their microfilms.
What was it? What did they find?
Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to show you. What they found was that much of the manuscript had what we know as the Hijazi script on it. And so therefore it was a very archaic manuscript. They dated it to 705. Now, Dr. Gerd Puyn has written about this. He's told why they chose this date, and you'll see why. But what's interesting is they found that the orders of the surahs were completely different than the orders of the surahs that we have today. And he found many words were different than what we have in the Quran today. And phrases were different. He found about 1,000 what we call manuscript variants. That means words or phrases that are at variant with the official Quran that we have today, the one that we have in this book here. But then the Arabic that we have in this book here is known as the Cairene text. And this was canonized in 1924. a little over 100 years ago. So this is a completely different script than what we see in the Sodom. Not completely different, but there are a lot of variances with it. But what's interesting is look at the script itself. You will see that on one side, and here I'm going to show you a page where you can see the script comes down about a third of the page down. Then there's a yellow mark there. That's Surah 19. After the yellow mark, it jumps to Surah 22. What happened to Surah 20 and 21?
That's right.
Missing from that page. Look over here on the left, and you will see Surah 20 begin. But it's in the wrong place. And take a look at the two pages, and you will see that on the right side, you have one script. On the left side, you have a completely different script, a much later script.
Wow.
So between the two pages, you have about 60 years between these two pages. This is 705. Over here, it's about 765 or 770. What does that say to you?
It's flawed. It's been changed.
More
Someone's
than that,
changed it, right?
More than that, it also says that looks like the Quran wasn't at all complete by the time of Muhammad. There was no way in the world that this could have been complete, certainly by 650, to say nothing about the late 7th century.
So the additions were made to it.
It looks like it. And even as late as 705, it still was incomplete.
Wow.
These other surahs had to be added on at a later date. What is more, as they looked at these earliest palimpsests, that means these pages from the earliest manuscripts, they put it under ultraviolet light, and they were able to see a script underneath. I'm going to show you a picture. You can see how there is a writing that's underneath the writing that's on the top. But using forensic evidence, they were able to separate the two scripts. And they were able to look at the lower script compared with the upper script. They're both Quranic, but they don't say the same thing. The earlier script are 7th century writings. The later script is 705 and later. So between the two
dates,
between the two scripts,
yes,
you find 20 to 30, sometimes as many as 40 years. Now this is all being done as we speak. This new material research has been done in the Sorbonne. It's also been done at Columbia University, where they're now looking and showing that the earliest Qurans, the earliest manuscripts, are not at all unanimous. And it looks like there are scripts that were written on, washed out over top, and then written over top of it.
Wow.
But using modern technology today,
we can see that.
we can now separate the two. And it's using this type of technology that shows that there's an evolution between the earlier script and the later script. So the question needs to be asked. If Mecca is a problem, if the Qibla is a problem, if the name Muslim is a problem, if the name Islam is a problem, all these don't exist in the 7th century. What about the Quran itself? It looks like the manuscripts for the Quran were created and from different schools, possibly different cities. But each one was competing with another, borrowed from many different sources. We mentioned earlier that even the stories in the Quran, you can see that many of the stories have been borrowed from other sources. Surah 5, Ayah 31, the story of Cain and Abel. And the bird, the raven that scratches in the ground, that comes from the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah. Surah 5, Ayah 32, which talks about the blood of Abel. If you take the blood of one, it says if you take the blood of all. But if you save the blood of one, it says if you save the blood of all. That comes from the Bar Sanhedrin, a 5th century document. The early ones of Jonathan ben Uzziah is a 2nd century document from the 2nd century AD and, of course, the 5th century AD. Surah 21. Ayah 51 to 71, the story of Abraham, comes from the 2nd Targum of Rabbah. Surah 27, Ayah 17 to 44, the story of the Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and the Hoopoe bird. Engaging story. That comes from the 2nd Targum of Esther. These are all apocryphal accounts, Jewish apocryphal writings. Much of this Quran can be borrowed from these Jewish apocryphal accounts. If you take a look at all the references to Jesus Christ, 93 references to Isa in the Quran. Even the name Isa is the wrong name. That is not an Arab name for Jesus. It should be Yeshua. Isa is borrowed from another source. We pretty much can trace back all those writings. There is a study that's finishing just this year, coming from John Gilchrist, that shows almost all the references to Jesus Christ, or Isa in the Quran, have been borrowed from the Nag Hammadi writings. These are the Gnostic writings from the 2nd century. They're nothing more than Gnostic writings of Jesus. The Jesus in the Quran is a Gnostic Jesus. All borrowed. At what time? It looks like the Quran was starting to be put together about the time of Abdul al-Malik. Remember that name?
Yes.
We've been coming back to that name, haven't we?
Yes.
All the way through this series, we're coming back to Abdul al-Malik. Looks like Abdul al-Malik wanted to create a prophet to create his own identity. In order to have a prophet, you have to have a book. Once you have the book, you need a place. In order to have a place, you need to have a history. Then you need to place the man in that history. So once the prophet was chosen, Muhammad, redacting back this man named Muhammad, of which we know of, he's a historical character. He did start the conquests. There's lots of writings called the Maghazi documents. The earliest material we do have from Ibn Hisham are the Maghazi documents. The earliest material we have that Ibn Hisham uses on Muhammad all talk about Muhammad's raids. He was a raider. He was one that started the conquests. But once you start giving him a book, the Quran, you can see how it was borrowed from many different areas. Created possibly in the early 8th century, maybe the late 7th century, but early 8th century. When it was canonized, that we don't know yet. I would suggest that probably soon after Abdul al-Malik, this book was canonized. But see, that's why so much of it's confusing. That's why there's so many contradictions. That's why it jumps all over the place. Because that's what you would expect when you have books, many different writings that are borrowed, put into one piece. So you have the man in the book, and then of course, Mecca had to be chosen. That was chosen possibly about 705, right, about the end of Abdul al-Malik's reign, placing him in Arabia. So you have an Arab prophet with an Arab revelation in Arabia. Then you've got to create the traditions. You've got to create the histories. All that takes place in the 9th and 10th century. Gives him a place, gives him sayings, and gives him basically his notoriety. All embellished, all of it from oral tradition. We can't trace any of those materials back to the 7th century.
Wow.
So what Tom Holland was asking at the very beginning, the very first episode, we talked about Tom Holland and his book, In the Shadow of the Sword, and his documentary, Islam, the Untold Story. This is the story that no one wants to hear. This is the Untold. That's a very appropriate name. The Untold Story is really the real story. Muhammad of history is not the same as the Muhammad of faith. The Muhammad of faith is the story surrounding this prophet that the Muslims have created, who then came into being, or I would say then came into ascendancy under Abdul al-Malik. Now they have their prophet who's an Arab prophet. Now they have their book, which is an Arab revelation. Now they have their place, which is in Arabia. They could then create their own identity around that. And that's why all of this comes to a piece. But it does not happen over 22 years in a nomadic environment called Mecca. It happens possibly over 50 to 60, maybe even 100 years. The theology then comes after that. Because once you have the traditions that surround the prophet himself, then you've got to create the laws and institutions. Now remember, all the 4 schools of law, Hanbali, Shafi, Maliki, Hanafi, all these 4 schools of law, when do they get introduced? In 820, 9th century again. So even the laws surrounding Islam, the Sharia law, all these laws known as fiqh, all of them only get introduced in the 9th century. That all fits to a piece.
Wow.
Islam as we know it did not come from Muhammad. Islam as we know it did not come from one man. It looks like it evolved over a period of decades, possibly over even 1 century.
Anyone listening to this would be quite shattered. If they're a Muslim, I mean, everything that they lean on are the things that you've just literally pulled apart. And I'm not saying that you've done this yourself. You haven't fabricated this stuff. This is all documented. This is all historical. But why are you doing this, Jay? Why are you saying this stuff?
And I'm going to talk to Muslims specifically when I'm saying this. Christianity had to go through the same exercise. We had to do this in the late 1800s there in Germany, in Tübingen, when Wellhausen asked the same questions concerning this book. He said, everything we know about this book is nothing more than fiction, more than probably oral tradition, folk tales that were probably put in somewhere about the 5th and 6th century BC and redacted back to a man named Moses in 1400 BC. Who then wrote about Abraham 1900 BC. But we can't trust it. A lot of it cannot be trusted. The person of Jesus Christ, we can't even trust who Jesus was, because all the references to Jesus, all the writings about Jesus were written in the 3rd and 4th century, redacted back onto the 1st century. So we had to go and find our material. In fact, it decimated the church. By 1905, all over Europe, people left the churches in their millions, and the church has never recovered. just from a simple question called historical criticism. Now, we're doing the same thing to the Quran. And every historical book needs to go through this test. And this is a historical book. It makes historical claims. Historical claims are neutral. Anybody should be asking what we're asking in these series. And not whether or not this book makes sense for us. Is it true? When it talks about Mecca, was there a place called Mecca in the time that Muhammad lived? Is there a prophet named Muhammad who was a universal prophet? The people at that time, did they call themselves Muslims? Where is there a religion called Islam? Why is it that all the material we have for Islam and for the emergence of Islam gets only written down in the 9th and 10th century? These are questions you have to ask. I'm asking this because every revelation has to be put up to this test. The Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Vedas, the Book of Mormon. The Bible has already passed that test.
Yes.
See, we've asked this question. We know who Jesus is.
Yes.
We have the eyewitness accounts. We have the references to him in the historical documents, even the, you might say, the polemics against him. Tacitus hated the Christians, yet he talked about Jesus when he died, even gives us the date for his crucifixion. We can trust the Bible historically. Can we trust the Quran historically? We can trust the emergence of Christianity historically. Can we do the same thing with Islam? And the answer is no. Yes to this book, not to this one.
Jay, thank you for your time.
Hey, not at all. It's great to be able to hear to help you with this.
We really hope we've been able to challenge our viewers today. Please stay in tune for the very next episode of Midnight Crime.